Okay. So it's my pleasure today to introduce my good friend and colleague, Dr. Susan Ziegler. She is a professor and Canada Research Chair in Boreal Forest Biogeochemistry in the Department of Earth Sciences at Memorial University in Newfoundland. She received her Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science in 1993 from UMass Amherst. She went on to get her PhD in Marine Science in 1998 from UT Austin. And then she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Carnegie Institute in 99 to 2000. And I got to meet Sue when we both were in our respective families in the BC era, that is before children. And Sue and her husband and me and my husband all did a lot of backpacking together. And so Sue has seen me in some very compromising positions, very vulnerable. And then both couples started to have children, and we did crazy things like go backpacking with hand breast pumps. And I got to tell you, it's exhausting. But Sue has seen me through some difficult times and has celebrated wonderful times with me. So we have a long-standing relationship and friendship, but we also have a long-standing colleague relationship. And we've worked together off and on, sometimes formally with grants and sometimes informally, just advising each other's students and looking at each other's data. We still write papers together because it's fun. And so I'm thrilled that she's here to visit. She's on sabbatical and she's here for a few weeks. She's leaving for a week. She's back for a few weeks. We'll go to AGU together. So I get to spend some time with her. So I asked her to give a seminar to our very own community here. And so I'm happy to have her share with you Tracking Soil Carbon on the Move. All of you can see why I like working with Sue with a title like that.
Thanks, Sharon. That was a lovely introduction. And it's really great to be here. And I'm glad everyone's here to share lunch with me. Yeah, I was trying to think when I was here last, and I had found this little picture of my younger son and his KU shirt. So this kind of dates when I was here last because he is now just starting university. He's quite young there. So I was like, there's the Jayhawk sweatshirt. Yeah, I kind of wanted to pull together a couple of things of what we're learning in the landscapes that we're studying in my region of the world, where we are in Newfoundland and Labrador. So this is like a wet boreal region. And try to uncover some of the aspects that we're learning with regard to what's happening with carbon as the climate is changing. And so there's some aspects here related to feedbacks, obviously, with that kind of stuff. I know Ariel said, are you just going to show us a bunch of pictures that are beautiful places? This is one of my favorite spots nearby that we go salmon fishing outside St. John's. But I did want to make acknowledgement and a number of acknowledgements here right at the beginning that I have the privilege of working in these beautiful landscapes that are actually the traditional territory of the Beothuk Mi'kmaq, as well as the Innu as well as to acknowledge a tremendous input, inspiration, and so forth from a number of really talented students and colleagues across the board and various funding agencies within the province and the federal government of Canada, making this worthwhile. And this includes Sharon, which is right pictured here in this old workshop that we had in Western Newfoundland years ago.
I still have that sweater.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk a bit about soil carbon, but in relationship to water that's moving through the landscape. And boreal soils in general, and this includes peatlands, provide a very large store. So this is the carbon that's stored as a function of the difference between what's taken up and what's lost, right, within the landscape for the most part. In the forest environment, which is what I'm primarily focusing on here, is right with these podzolic soils and represents probably around 30% of the carbon in forests, soil carbon in forests overall. So it's a good place to kind of look at these materials, both on a global, regional, and very local scale. The thing with these deeper soil carbon stocks, and my colleagues where I am in Newfoundland laugh because they say you study soils, and they say, are there really soils? So I have to show them pictures that there is soil down there. It's not all rock. It is soil, even in these subsoils and these deeper parts of the landscape. But there's a lot of uncertainty when we get into these soils. And this is not just unique to post-glaciated landscapes, but it's particularly difficult in these rocky environments. We want to figure these things out. One of the things about that carbon that accumulates is that it's a function of not only the vertical fluxes that happen in the landscape, so essentially the net ecosystem exchange that occurs and the carbon that accumulates in these forest environments are also subjected to changes related to lateral transfers. And so these can include the movement of dissolved organic carbon, which can be a part of that net ecosystem exchange, or can contribute to the extent to which carbon accumulates, that big delta C, for example, in forest. And so taking a watershed perspective is something a lot of people are doing now, recognizing these connections and the importance of some of these transfers that are otherwise a little bit difficult. And over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a recognition of the movement of carbon from the terrestrial to the aquatic environment, and the fact that it actually represents something on the order of what we see in terms of the big net sinks, right, in the ocean and in land. That number is very uncertain because it comes from actually adding up essentially what's being buried in the freshwater environment, what's evading from the freshwater environment, and tacking all those together to come up with that amount rather than a direct measurement. And the number has been increasing, and there's a large range, and there's a lot of interest in trying to constrain that. And one of the reasons the interest is there is that the terrestrial and basically the land and atmosphere flux of CO2 as depicted through Earth system models is highly uncertain. Compared to the ocean, it's a kind of a dog's breakfast, if you will. And when we look at these estimates that we have so far of the terrestrial aquatic flux, it's a pretty large component in that. And that could be something that we could use to help to constrain that uncertainty that we have moving forward with this particular flux of carbon that's essentially globally important. And some of the examples when people have looked at this with certain modeling efforts and so forth is that it's possible that we're overestimating some of these models, soil respiration, or perhaps overestimating carbon accumulation by not incorporating this lateral carbon flux. In a recent modeling exercise on a global scale suggests that about 15% of the net EEP, the net ecosystem production, is represented by the movement of dissolved organic carbon out of terrestrial ecosystems. This is a modeling, this is an estimate. It doesn't include peatlands or organic rich soil layers. It's actually all based on mineral soil. So that could be significant. And another aspect of that modeling, kind of on a global scale, is that boreal landscapes have likely experienced the largest change and increase in that. Okay, so there's some real reasons to look at this and try to combine our understanding of the movement of water through soils and what's actually happening in the fate of this carbon pool. So we're interested collectively in my group and amongst collaborators in understanding what controls this flux in boreal landscapes as part of our understanding of these soil carbon stocks as well. And just generally speaking, when we think about a DOC flux in any landscape, it really does come down to, to what extent is soil dissolved organic carbon being mobilized? So how leachable is it? It has to do with what goes into the soil, but also how the water is moving through the soil. And then secondly, the fate of that dissolved organic carbon within the lower layers of the soil. Okay, so in the subsoils, what happens to the DOC once it is mobilized in that environment? And so what we were trying to do is try to understand a little bit better about the controls, about these two controls and how they're responding to climate change. So how is mobilization of DOC responding, and how is the either the uptake or the loss of that DOC from soils actually responding to changes in climate? So those are kind of like our basic questions here that I'd like to focus on a little bit today. And it's informed by a long-term latitudinal gradient study. So this is the Newfoundland and Labrador Boreal Ecosystem Latitudinal Transect. Sharon helped decide what that name would be, the NL belt, which is a latitudinal gradient of over 5 degrees of latitude and a little bit about that in temperature. Also a 50% increase in precipitation to go from north to south. And it consists of replicate forested sites across the region. and headwater stream sites in each of those regions. And it is actually, there's 4 actual watershed regions. I'm not going to talk about the one down here, except to bring in this experimental watershed that we have that has much more infrastructure within it than we have in our broader sites. So we've been working in these sites since 2011. And as a consequence of making measurements of all the basic sort of ecosystem things like litter fall and looking at the soil stocks and the composition, CO2 fluxes and solute fluxes through can lysimeters across these sites, we're actually able to put together some information about how the fluxes look over on an annual basis and look at the variability from year to year. And Sharon was involved in a lot of the initiation of building and putting in lysimeters. She came out in 2011 as part of your sabbatical and helped to initiate and also design some of these things in terms of the infrastructure that we put into place. So it's kind of cool to talk about this with Sharon here. So when what we've observed across, and this again, I'm going to emphasize that this initial look from about 4 or 5 years of data collected, this is a surface soil perspective going from the cooler high latitude or sites up in Labrador to the warmer sites on the southwest part of the island, warmer and wetter areas. Of course, you expect to have the enhancement of soil respiration and solute increases because we're talking about more precipitation. So the DOC flux through the soil, so how it's mobilized going from the organic horizon to mineral soil, and litter fall flux. So overall, we've got this intensification of rates as we go into the warmer and wetter forests. What was interesting to us is that the actual soils themselves and the organic horizon and the very surface, like top 10 centimeters of the mineral soil, was maintained across the transect, regardless of these large changes in fluxes. So despite the fact that there's these increases, we're seeing this sort of maintenance. We have to ask a little bit about the fate of this very large change in the mobilization of that dissolved organic carbon, because that really is going to have something to do with what's stored deeper in those deeper mineral soils. And so what the fate of that is something that became subject of more information, more interest, particularly because of the shifts that we have going on with respect to precipitation. So the broad picture of precipitation is going to increase, in higher latitudes, but the form of that precipitation is not all the same. And what it falls as, when and at what rate is likely very important when we look at the reactivity of these soils. Okay, so the leaching processes and the transport processes and where that DOC actually moves to and through what layers in the soil, for example. And this is not a new thing to look at soil DOC and try to relate it to climate, right? So this was a review paper back in, over 20 years ago. And basically, indicated very nicely that mean annual precipitation was very well correlated to dissolved organic carbon fluxes in various landscapes. And when we put our 4 years of data and look at the average and the range across from the cold to the warmest, it kind of fits in there largely as well. And so precipitation controls, DOC mobilization and increases with mean annual precipitation. But when we unpackage what we have within those and look at the interannual variation, it doesn't line at all with precipitation. It doesn't relate to precipitation. We have very large variation from year to year in rainfall. And so Kiri Bowering, who finished her PhD a couple of years ago, took on a number of studies related to controls on the mobilization of soil dissolved organic matter across our sites from a number of different perspectives. And one of the things that she found was that it was actually related to temperature and more importantly, related to winter temperature. So what she found that controlled the mobilization, so this is the source of the DOC, is that winter temperatures and the duration of the snowpack best explain the variation we can see across these forest landscapes. And so we are trying to ask, well, okay, what's the mechanism there? And we are monitoring soil temperature, within this organic horizon and the mineral soils, and we don't have soil freezing. Even in the sites in Labrador, we don't detect soil freezing because it's a very wet place. We get a lot of snow. So anywhere between like 30 and 40% of our precipitation is snow. And that snowpack is really important for insulating the soils below. And so instead of what Peter Groffman had come up with in terms of, the colder soils in a warmer world, where freezing soils was a really important mechanism that he demonstrated for mobilizing more DOC. What we're dealing with is something a little bit different, which relates probably to the fact that the microbes themselves, who are very happy under the snowpack and for a longer duration, actually degrade a lot of soil organic matter. And then it's not available for being moved. And I'm not going to focus on that, but we have chemical composition data that tell us that that is happening to a significant degree in these landscapes. But there's also another way in which this could happen, this enhancing of the DOC, is that with less snowpack, whether duration and amount of snowpack, you're changing the hydrology within those forest landscapes such that you're reducing more immediate runoff. And by shifting more of the water towards rainfall, through earlier parts of the winter and in the fall, we're talking about increased infiltration potentially. So that's another potential mechanism. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some evidence that we have for that additional mechanism for enhancing the mobilization. And this comes from a combination of information, but is largely informed when we look at like a small catchment scale. So this is a study site area that we have developed over like the last 6 years actually. And it's a small 11 square kilometer catchment and represents different parts of the landscape where we have low relief and more steep forested catchment areas, and we're monitoring basically stream sites within there, as well as instrumented hill slope, where we've got our piezometers, lysimeters, and wells. And in this area, we're capturing the dynamics of storm events in particular in terms of their mobilization of dissolved organic carbon and relating that back to what we're learning in the hill slopes. So to see what's happening with regard to the routing of dissolved organic carbon. And I just wanted to pull a few points about that relates back to the hypothesis on hydrology. And what's happening when we look at an annual picture, we have basically 2 periods of the year, of course, right? Snow melt, and then we have a lot more rain events that are moving water through the landscape to a greater extent in the fall. So those are the wet periods, right? And they do differ though with the type of water and the hydrology that's going on at that time, with spring melt periods really being more dominated by a greater extent of new water. And that's surficial water coming in with the rainfall events, right? Rather than water that's already in the stream and more distant groundwater inputs. So snow melt is associated with greater amount of immediate runoff, whereas these events that we get in the wetter fall after ET has shut down largely, and we get a wetting up of the landscape, there is, again, more consistently proportions of that old water, and the new water is there, but to a much less extent. So what we've been trying to do is to monitor this year after year to get a better idea of like how consistent this is, and of course, eventually understand any shifts that are happening between these seasons. But as we add up different years here, we see that basically it's almost like a 50-50 old water, new water during the spring melt hydrologic event that we see from year to year. Whereas in the fall, it's more largely attributed to water that has infiltrated through the landscape more to a greater extent. So more like a 70-30 kind of split. We're continuing to build upon this data set, but I think it speaks to sort of a shift as we go and move that water around and how it's actually coming through the landscape that's having these impacts on the soils themselves. So with increasing winter temperature, decreasing snowpack, we're talking about enhanced mobilization because of the shifts in degradation, so reduction of degradation, and probably an enhancement in infiltration happening kind of on an annual basis, and therefore contributing to this greater mobilization of dissolved organic carbon in the landscape. So what does this mean in terms of SOC, so soil organic carbon, and potentially like export to the aquatic environment? So, and on a global scale, we think of SOC, there's a real important component here with respect to water availability. And in these systems, as we increase the excess amount of water available from precipitation to move through the landscape, of course, we're enhancing weathering, and we get into systems where more and more of the carbon that's actually stored, the soil organic carbon that's stored, is actually there in a form where it's associated with reactive metals, okay? And that's very much the case in our system where we get into the deep soils, we typically see exactly what the authors here have found, that about 60% of the soil carbon at depth is actually in these forms, these associations, co-precipitation with reactive metals. So these are podzolic soils, and that dissolved organic matter, as I talked about, that DOC, it's coming from nice, rich, kind of cakey organic matter at the top, is moving through the soil and is actually weathering out some of these reactive metals, aluminum and iron. And essentially they form these complexes through co-precipitation as well as adsorption processes with those weathering products. And they form these, I'll use this OMC thing, this organometal complex, as sort of this form of organic carbon in the soil. And in these soils, we found that aluminum is most important for explaining the distribution of soil organic carbon, primarily because these are wet places. So the redox controls on iron seems to destabilize the iron forms to a greater extent. And so aluminum is a better explanatory metal in these more wetter soils. And so organic matter complex formation occurs in basically two steps. You have basically the weathering rate of the soluble complexes, and then precipitation that occurs. And that depends upon the concentration of aluminum, also iron, and the pH. And what's really cool about these soils is the pH is actually going from something on the order of 3.5. And once it hits the mineral soil in those solutions, it goes up to 4 to 4.5, sometimes 5 in like the winter. And that's an important pH range for really contributing to this co-precipitation of aluminum and carbon in the system, as shown through equilibrium experiments that have been going on for a long time. Very standardized thing. But when we think about soils in the real environment where we have all this water careening through the landscape, we have to think a little bit about what this means on non-equilibrium cases, right? So if the water's ripping through there, what happens? So with climate change, of course, we have a greater source. We've shown this mobilization of DOC, but with more water, of course, we're talking about potentially diluting that soil solution, which could prevent the co-precipitation reactions from happening, right? That could limit the availability of that soil organic carbon to form these complexes, or DOC to form these complexes with the metal. So is the solution going to become too dilute? So specifically, we were interested in seeing in the landscape, because in Newfoundland and Labrador, we have a tremendous diversity of geology. So if you have a climate transect, it's kind of annoying. We can't really keep everything the same. So we decided to explore the variation and embrace the fact that the geology is so different in each of our sites. So we're like, okay, so what's the role of that parent material? It turns out to be quite diverse across these areas. And does that play a role on the vulnerability of these soils with all this extra water? And the other aspect that we've been looking at is the hillslope hydrology. And I'm not going to be able to there's not enough time to talk about that in great detail. This is work that was conducted by Dr. Mackenzie Patrick. So she just finished and successfully defended her PhD last week, which was very exciting. And she's really dug into a lot of this work. And she looked at this from two perspectives. One, using the transect, so using soils from the surface mineral soils across the transect to look at the controls of parent material and climate. And she was looking at these topographic controls by exploring our experimental watershed hillslope, hillslope sites, where she was able to look at different depths and along a low relief and a foot slope area where the hydrology is so different. What's interesting is I showed you earlier that the southern sites have much higher DOC flux. They also have very well maintained and higher stocks of carbon in the organic horizons. However, by looking at the entire mineral soil profile, we found that the stocks of carbon are actually lower in that wetter, warmer forests. That's despite those higher inputs. So that was a first clue that there was something going on very differently between these areas. And it looks like it has a lot to do with that parent material. we have a lot more of the aluminum in that form that reacts with organic matter. So this is an operational pool of aluminum that's extracted with pyrophosphate extractant. And we can see in the southern, just a couple examples of profiles. These are the warm ones and the cold regions, the most northern region. We have much higher concentrations of those reactive forms of aluminum, and it looks like it's regionally dependent. I'm not showing the middle region because it is all over the place in terms of the concentrations, and they nicely correlate with soil carbon concentration, but they do not consistent by region. When we look at the carbon saturation of that aluminum, or we look at how much of the carbon is in that form, so that's that earlier graph I showed you on the global distribution, we can see that that is not regionally specific. It's really depth dependent, telling us that really the water availability, because this is a regional study, the water balance and probably the infiltration for the most part is generally consistent across the region. And the controls on carbon saturation are generally consistent, telling us that really the driver here in terms of the quantity of organic carbon in those systems is largely driven by this aluminum availability. And that's attributed to like what parent material is there and the degree of weathering that has been able to occur. So explaining a little bit about why we're seeing these really big differences between the most southern and the most northern mineral soil horizons profiles. So the question is, what's going to happen with short-term climate change? And short-term climate change in our region not only has to do with shortening the snow pack duration, but is also atmospheric rivers and large rain events that are happening in late summer into early fall. So we're talking about really big rainfall events on what is otherwise relatively dry soils. And so, for example, this is an event that we had last September around where I live in St. John's, but the southwest corner of the island has been getting atmospheric river events of like 250 millimeters of rain quite frequently over the last 4 years. And we've done trend analysis, and I'm not going to show you that using hydrographic records as well as precipitation records. And so we have snowmelt peaks reducing generally in the north, and we have fall peak discharge increasing generally in the south. So those are the dynamics for which these soils are experiencing in the region. And so Mackenzie was interested in trying to emulate this. So taking those soils from all those different contexts across the transect and across the hill slope, and basically subjecting them to 150 millimeter rain event using lysimeter water. So taking the water that we pump out of the site and reconstructing small columns to the same bulk density and rock content that we find in various horizons to these large events, and then collecting the particulates and the leachates basically to see what happened, what was the net change essentially. You know, did these soils take up DOC? Did they release DOC? And what was going on with the metals and so forth? So when she looked at the surface top 10 centimeters of the mineral soil and across the transect, not super exciting. There was no regional effect. It was largely just a function of the saturation of the aluminum, the reactive aluminum pools. That was really the driver of to what extent dissolved organic carbon was taken up from the soil. So I'm going to show a few figures here. And what this axis is showing is essentially if it's above the line, dissolved organic carbon was taken up by the soil. If it's below the line, it actually released. So you can see these surface soils are largely releasing dissolved organic carbon as a function of large rain events. Okay. Regardless of what region we're in, regardless of what geological parent material is, it all comes back to whether there was a lot of carbon relative to that reactive aluminum or not. So how saturated it is. So looking at the hill slope perspective, so just taking mineral soils from the top B horizon and the BC horizon, we can see quite a difference here. And that's because we're getting a much broader range because we're looking at depth in terms of the saturation. So those soils that are up at the top are saturated more so with carbon relative to reactive metal. And then the ones that are at depth are actually showing a lot of potential for storage because they're undersaturated with respect to the aluminum, reactive aluminum, and driving this relationship that we're seeing here. So yeah, that makes sense. There's a depth relationship there. But putting these together was really useful because what it provided us with is a threshold that seems to depict really well for this region for that saturation, telling us, to what extent are the soils likely to take up more carbon or to release more carbon with rainfall events, like big rainfall events in the soil, as a function of the variation in this saturation of carbon. And so this could become useful for us in terms of predicting the response of soil carbon and understanding why they're there. It's probably also very helpful for us in understanding the turnover of carbon because it appears to also be well correlated to the mean age of the SOC as observed through radiocarbon across here, where those soils that are taking up carbon and undersaturated are turning over much more slowly. And then any of those that are beyond that saturation point are very dynamic. They're absorbing and releasing in a very dynamic way and therefore very young in terms of their mean age. So turning over more rapidly. So soil stores are really regionally, like in this region, looks like controlled by that parent material and particularly aluminum. So in the north, we have a lot of ultramafic rocks, and we have basically the till, for example, is ultramafic dominated with a lot of aluminum-rich feldspars, unlike the south, which is sedimentary controlled till. The capacity of soils to stabilize and therefore take up DOC during large rain events appears to be really largely a function of the saturation of those reactive aluminum pools. And the dissolved organic matter that's fueling all this is coming in with precipitation events, and that's happening more so now in the fall. And those are part of larger events that are happening following dry summers. And those summers are getting a little drier with the enhancement of productivity in the region, and therefore evapotranspiration. So does that dynamic also have an impact on the fate of this carbon in these landscapes? So in the same set of experiments, one of the things that McKinsey did was actually do multiple events. And sort of emulating like, end of summer on dry soil, if you've got the big event right at the end of summer, so maybe the atmospheric river came in at that point, or if it came in after the soils have already been wet up a little bit, versus the end of fall when the soils are really wet. Are there differences? So basically every replicate column, whatever soils it came from, received these like sequential events, if you will, allowing us to sort of tease apart whether or not maybe those antecedent conditions were having a role. So were the antecedent conditions having a role on the DOC uptake? And essentially what she observed, which was kind of helpful to understand, is that, yeah, of course, and that makes sense. And we know that dry soils that get re-wet, that's been shown time and time again that there is this release, right, of carbon as associated with dry soils. But what's kind of interesting here is that there is this continuing movement of that point of saturation. So the threshold that I was mentioning earlier actually increases the soil moisture. So it tells us that there's this dynamic that's happening in the landscape as a function of soil moisture, which could really help us understand a little bit more about predicting the pools and also the potential for storage or loss from the landscape. So understanding the size of those events is important, but more importantly, probably the timing and the antecedent conditions under which the soils were at. So having that information on soil moisture can be pretty critical to understanding the capacity for the soils to take up dissolved organic carbon. So that threshold moving is really important. And it's kind of interesting that as you go through the fall, that you could have an increased capacity potentially for uptake of DOC. So one last point about this is that we can use the depth profiles that we have for saturation. And this is something that many people probably have, through profiles and different kinds of systems, to model what the soil moisture response is. And of course, this is differing by region. So if we look at the north, where there's a lot more aluminum, you don't have to increase the depth of infiltration very far before you get uptake of carbon, even in the very dry conditions. But in the south, where there's a sedimentary kind of till material that's contributing and has a lot less aluminum available, you have to get to a much deeper depth before those dry conditions will take up, dry soils will be able to take up carbon with a particular event. So infiltration rates would have to be higher in order to have any sort of uptake in response to those kinds of events. So kind of putting these things together, we sort of have an ability to now take some of that information and have an understanding of what the potential is for soils and what their changes might be, and do some modeling with that. And interestingly, when we put this in a catchment perspective, we see some evidence on a catchment scale that corroborates these kinds of changes with dry antecedent conditions and changes in carbon movement and mobilization from the landscape. This is Alan Roback, who I had the pleasure of working with a couple of years ago. And he actually was, he's a river biogeochemist, and got interested in looking at these headwater streams and dissolved organic carbon mobilization. And we have a number of events, so numbers of years where we're looking very specifically at all these fall events and the timing of these. And this is just an example looking at a September event versus a November event process. And essentially what happens with increasing discharge, of course, you get changes in concentration. Depending upon the kind of landscape, you can have different relationships here. But because this is a fairly steep landscape, there's a much more linear kind of relationship. But what's important here is that the yield of carbon is actually, the release of carbon from the landscape is much higher in September than it was in November as the antecedent conditions got wetter. And the composition of that organic matter kind of tells a little bit of the story that, in fact, in those the early fall drier conditions, you get this lower aromaticity of the carbon, and probably more of sort of that release of sort of microbial derived and less fresh plant material during that early event, as opposed to what's clearly a lot more aromaticity from the moist conditions happening later in November. And this is something that we've shown, and we look at the yield across multiple events because we're now monitoring DOC continuously in these sites using instrumentation and relationships that we have with DOC. And that clearly backs up the soil story with respect to the antecedent controls on the fate of that dissolved organic carbon that's coming from the very surface soils in the environment. So going back to that original question, what controls that DOC flux in these landscapes, these forest landscapes? That mobilization of DOC, and then of course the fate within the soil is going to dictate to what extent it gets exported to the aquatic environment and how it influences the soil carbon stores, of course. And interest in the controls responding to climate change, I mentioned that the mobilization is really a function of these warmer winters. This enhanced mobilization that we're observing in these landscapes is coming from that combined reduction in the microbial decomposition in winter and the increasing infiltration that's probably happening as a function of the shift from more snowpack to less snowpack and more fall infiltration. The fate of DOC within the soil, well, I mean, it could be in some ways fed by greater enhanced infiltration, where we have greater fall events, fall precipitation, and reduced runoff by spring melt. But the degree to which that DOC is going to be stabilized in soil is really, really a function of that aluminum content and the weatherability. So for the parent material in the region, but also the slope and the resulting infiltration, something I didn't talk about very much, but having that perspective of the hillslope hydrology is really important, and the size and the timing of the event. So this is the antecedent conditions. So in one way, having that information about the aluminum availability from the parent material, knowing about the slope and therefore the infiltration capacity in the environment, combined with soil moisture and precipitation timing, one could actually have a lot of information available to understand and predict the changes of the soil carbon. And Mackenzie is working with our local or provincial survey, because they're actually doing a lot of work on till across the province. And she's planning to actually model carbon stocks and then go back and check. And we'll be able to see if those predictions do a better job constraining what we have at depth, and then what the potential is for changes going forward with precipitation regimes and landscape attributes like slope. So yeah, so that's a quick story about trying to put the the hydrology together with the soil, with the soil carbon. Hopefully, you guys have some questions. Thanks for your attention. I appreciate it. It's nice to have a talk about it.
What's a lysometer and a?
Sorry. Yes. So the lysimeters are, there's many types of lysimeters. And they're a way of obtaining and like collecting soil solution. We were using what are called passive pan lysimeters, and essentially we constructed a like an oil pan. You know, you can use an oil pan that's slanted, and putting it underneath the organic horizon with a grate on the top of it, and then having like plumbing down below, and basically goes into a collection container. We actually had to use 20-liter carboys underground. So these are all installed down slopes, so they wouldn't affect what would be happening because there's so much water. But in other different environments, people will use suction lysimeters, which would be like a porous plate in place, and then you actually use suction to pull water from the matrix. What we're interested in is basically what's moving. We weren't interested in just knowing what it looks like. We wanted to know quantify what was moving. The piezometers are used largely in a similar way, but they're like almost like the smaller wells. And so we place piezometers as pipes down into the mineral soil at different depths, and allows us, when the water is actually saturated, to pull samples. And then we also have instrumentation that will tell us at what level the water is at in the mineral soil profile, which does, comes up and moves up and down. So there are ways that we can access the solution that's on the move through the hill slope, essentially, in the forest.
The saturated level moves up in there.
Yeah. Yeah, in the soil. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What's old water and new water? And
Yeah.
seminar. So is that like isotopic ratios?
Yeah. So Aaron, did you go to Aaron Siebold's talk earlier this week? Because she talked about old
that
water.
reflects like difference, like soil microbes, respiration and production, uptake and respiration. Is that ideal?
No.
What's old water?
So this has to do with the age of the water, and it is like, it's a funny terminology. So Aaron Siebold talked about old water, new water, and she was using isotopes, so hydrogen, oxygen isotopes, to do that. And when she gave her talk, she was saying that basically, the old water is things that are older than 3 months old, new water is within 3 months. The context of old water, newer here is a little bit different relative to that, because this is a much wetter landscape. So here I'm speaking of old water as essentially water that's already there. So it's there and it's being fueled by, basically sourced by groundwater. So deeper groundwater. The new water is essentially any water that comes in that's not actually already in the system. So it's precipitation, and that's basically, instead of 3 months, it's more on the order of like days. So we're comparing basically things that come in the order of like days to maybe a week or so, versus what's actually being like it's just the water source that's being sourced from water within the system already, if that makes sense. And it's an interesting distinction, but basically we're using it to distinguish between water that has passed quickly through surface soil horizons versus water that's actually infiltrated over time and is contributing now to the stream flow. I don't know if does that make sense? It's a broad distinction.
How do you measure aromaticity?
Oh, aromaticity.
Carbon.
Yeah, so there's a couple ways we look at aromaticity. One is to directly measure it using NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance. And the other is, so there's 3 ways. The other way is to look at specific compounds that are aromatic, but that's limited to just like lignin phenols. And then there's a proxy measurement, which is the one I showed you, which is basically how much the water actually absorbs UV radiation. So different wavelengths of UV radiation. And that's been shown to correlate pretty well with aromaticity. It correlates pretty well in our system to lignin that we find in solution. So those are the 3 ways that we look at. Yeah, using a spectrophotometer.
Tell me the difference between proteins and RNA and DNA. Like,
Yeah,
anyway, okay.
that's right.
So you're able to make some educated guess about the change of export of DOC from your systems. It's a function of climate change, but the climate feedbacks is going to depend on what happens downstream then, right?
Yeah.
Is that being studied as well, like how how like the DOC that is exported from the system is going to be
Yeah.
fixed in some way?
So my group is only studying that at the other end of the spectrum, which is like what happens in the river, right? But we would like to go into sort of like where it's happening to the ponds. I don't know if in the map that I have there, like the landscapes are poorly developed where we are, right? So you have like basically because of the glacial retreat, you have very low relief areas that are pond and wetland dominated at the top, and then incised streams that are steep and will support all the forest landscapes. And then it gets low again, and then you have wetland associated with riverine. So you can see like there's all these differences with respect to what will happen with that DOC that ends up being released from the landscape. And so you can have burial, if there's potential for that, respiration, that's going to support heterotrophy, and then eventually export further downstream. And one of the things that we've been looking at is how it participates in flocculation, so the forming of particles in the marine environment. Because there's a lot of interest up and down the coast where we are with respect to the changes in the river dynamics. And many regions, even further south, like in Maine, like the Penobscot River, that's very well studied by USGS, they're seeing these enhancement and dissolved organic carbon export, and that seems to be happening a lot through fall and winter. And so we want to know, okay, so what's the net result of that? Is it being buried? Is it being respired out? I mean, the majority of it's respired, right? Largely speaking, but we want to know that difference. And that's sort of that concept I was showing at the beginning of looking at things at the watershed scale, because if 15% of the net ecosystem productivity, I don't know if it is, we actually want to know what the fate of it is. So understanding how it's controlled in terms of magnitude and figuring out what the composition of it is. And then having those studies that look at, what controls flocculation will help us. Like we found that like the iron, it was kind of nice. We found the iron to DOC ratio is really a nice factor to predict that flocculation, at least in different rivers, and it varies. So that ratio varies quite a bit in like, medium river sizes that are very common along the coast. So yeah, absolutely. Like you have to know the fate if you want to like close the loop on what the carbon balance is in the landscape. Yeah. Yep. Thanks a lot, guys. It was great to talk.